for a costume if you're going to a Halloween party tomorrow. One that says costumes strongly encouraged, that kind of event. How about going as a tax collector? You could wear a suit and, maybe stick a pen or pencil behind your ear like that. And you could even take a monocle if they try to add to the whole thing. And then you can carry a notebook and jot down what you think each person should be giving to the community or to the church or whatever. You're just going to keep track of the money, where it is and who's giving it. And if you can avoid being ejected from this gathering and have enough time to sit a whole evening in a corner by yourself because no one's willing to talk to you, then you might learn some interesting things. Last Sunday, we heard about the tax collector who was so ashamed of his work as a tax collector that he stood off in a corner of the temple, beating his breast, unable to even look up, and he was so ashamed of himself, he couldn't imagine that God, not to mention Jesus, was going to be ever interested in him or his life. Now, tax collectors, they worked for Rome, and they went out and they collected taxes from all of the people, and these taxes were not, small. It was get every piece of money you can out of these people. And the only way the taxpayer gets paid, because this isn't a job with, like a 401k plan and all that, he has to add a little bit to each person's taxes so that he has enough to live by. Now, I'm guessing, I have no idea if this is true, but depending on who you're collecting taxes from and how well you manage to conceal some of the money from Rome, you could get pretty well off in this job. And it's no surprise that everybody hates you. They do not want to be eating with you. They don't want to do anything with you. They just want you to get away and leave them alone. So, not only are you unwilling to leave them alone, but you're also there. And they know that you're there for Rome. And so, you just wonder, how is anything good going to come out of this? This Zacchaeus up in the tree, who knows what he was thinking, but he's up there, and then, now some of the people that I read, talking about this, they said Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, and it's not that he wanted Jesus to see him, he wanted to see Jesus, and I suppose he wanted to see him in part because he's heard about him, and he'd like to keep track of what's going on in his territory. But Jesus sees him. And at that moment, when Jesus says, come on down, we're going to have dinner together tonight at your house, you can imagine Zacchaeus is probably very confused and wondering what's going to come next. But the weird thing is, what comes next is Zacchaeus saying, oh, guess what? I'm going to give money, anybody that I have taken too much from, I'm going to pay them back fourfold. I'm going to make these terrible things that I've done, I'm going to undo them as much as I can. I'm going to show that I actually care. And now that I'm with Jesus, somehow, this is all happening before he even gets to the house. And he's thinking, I feel better. I feel better because I tried to make things right. And even if I haven't made it right for everybody, I'm going to keep looking and and make it right as best I can. Now, that's a very peaceful way of changing someone's idea of how the world should work. And Jesus seemed to do it just by a glance, and he did it by eating with people that nobody else wanted to eat with. Excuse me. And you know how often that Jesus is spoken of as, you just can't trust Jesus. He eats with tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes, and this guy is down there with the worst of the worst. And still we can't help following him, because for some reason this is just where we're called to be. And so you think about some of the things that are going on in our country, and there are so many people that seem to be harboring so much hate inside of them. Now, some of them, people like us, we tend to be able to hide it as a little bit. We're careful with how we say things about whatever candidate we're supporting, and we want to make sure that no matter what side the other person is on, they're not going to feel threatened by us. And that's a good start, but there seems like there should be a lot more to it than that. Now, I read this column online that comes from Dan Rather. He started this group called Steady, and the whole idea of steadiness is something that I really appreciate right now. If you can be steady in what you believe and how you believe it and what you're trying to accomplish, then you're probably going to be successful. And he's a little worried about our country. And he wrote this right after the news of that man who went into Paul and Nancy Pelosi's house and attacked her husband with a knife, or not a knife, a hammer. Whoever does that. But that's what he did. And you can do a lot of damage with a hammer. You don't need a gun to do a lot of damage. And Dan Rather says we should not be shocked that this happened. We have seen the storm clouds of political violence assemble. There is a direct line from January 6th to today, and it stretches even farther backward. We should be very careful about using the term fascism, but a political system plunging toward normalized violence and instability is one that is taking on very dark undertones. Now, Nancy Pelosi says has been a lightning rod for Republican ire for a long time. Sometimes she's kind of been a lightning rod for Democratic ire as well. But whatever you think, it doesn't lead you to the idea that it would be possible to break into her house and beat her with a hammer. So he writes, but something changed alongside Trump's mainstreaming of viciousness and allusions to violence that were not previously acceptable in modern political discourse. Pelosi's personal safety and that of her peers has become less certain. That many of her colleagues on the other side of the aisle wink at or outright encourage political threats make the situation even more dire. There is a swelling mass hysteria on the political right. Now in churches, these days, it's supposed to be this way for a long time in our country, we don't tell you who to vote for or what political party you should be part of or what you should think about one politician or another. But we do talk about what it means to be Christian and what it means to be nonviolent. And so, when he writes there is a swelling mass hysteria on the political right, it isn't to say that people on the political right are wrong about anything in particular, about their policies or many other things, but that within this group, something is happening. It is lubricated by lies, bigotry, misplaced grievances, and political rhetoric. It can be found in the memes on social media, the chants of lock her up, the armed patrols of voting drop boxes, and certainly the violent attempted coup at the Capitol. Just as last night's intruder reportedly shouted, "Where is Nancy?" the rioters streaming through the Capitol hallways on January 6th were also looking for the House Speaker. Do we really need to speculate what might have happened if they found her? And so, from what's going on here, he switches to where do we fit into the world? Because in many countries around the world, political violence is the norm. And we like to pride ourselves in the United States that we are different, and we point to the fact that partisans of both parties have traditionally respected the results of our free and fair elections. We boast about our peaceful transfers of power. How did that work out in 2020, he asks. What are the prospects for the midterm less than 2 weeks away? What about 2024? And then comparing it to climate change, which is very interesting. But just as climate change doesn't create hurricanes, but does make them more dangerous, the poisonous discourse spewed on some radio or TV stations pushes our political environment closer to the edge of an abyss. It's too late to say someone might get hurt. Many already have, and we should not expect much soul searching for those who are immersed in the cult of personality that animates Trump and the most extreme of his followers. Most of his followers are no more in favor of violence than any of us in this room would be. And most of all, this violence should cause us to pause, to step back, and to remember that we are all human beings. We want to say this is not who we are, and we are desperate to believe it, and I think most Americans agree. But violence and the threat thereof doesn't need anywhere close to a majority in order to wreak havoc. I never thought about that before, but that's certainly true. One man with a hammer makes Nancy Pelosi and her children and her grandchildren and a lot of other politicians worry and to be afraid and to not know what they can or should say and where they should say it and how they should say it. And that's why he says it must be condemned, prosecuted, and thoroughly repudiated. So it just so happens that it was also the weekend, and Richard Rohr has his weekly things to say on religious matters or whatever. And he's tackling the issue of what does nonviolence mean? He says that for him, nonviolence is that quality that comes out of the great world religions, The notion that the creative force of the universe is love, and that God is love, and that love is all encompassing. Gandhi insisted, and I think this is his greatest contribution, this is Richard Rohr writing, that the creative force of the universe is the force that we humans must learn to exercise, because that force is the only force that can cause the human race to do God's will. The creative force of the universe. And we want to be part of that creative force, don't you think? I mean, that's part of the reason we have our culturally responsive dinners and our peace garden, and we try and find out about what happened in our country years ago, even though it's long past and we had nothing personally to do with it. And then a different writer, but also working with Richard Rohr, wrote that Gene Sharp was the first scholar to pull together the science and the methodology of nonviolence. So he says, I have a twofold definition. First, the religions of the world reflect on love as truth and power, as the way the human race discovers how to carry out the will of eternity. Second, we're still learning about nonviolence as the science of bringing about personal and social change and establishing a world where all life is honored. Seems like that's a pretty big order, to find and establish a world where all life is honored. And then there's Valerie Carr of the Revolutionary Love Project. And she understands her Sikh warrior tradition through a nonviolent lens that asks, who will you fight for on behalf of justice and peace? What does it mean to be a warrior sage for a new time? Who will you fight for? What will you risk? It begins with honoring the fight impulse in you. I mean, don't think